Until now, we talked about how we can process variables and values coded statically into the program. From now on, we can receive input from the user, and our program is going to behave according to those inputs. And let's begin. So we have seen this print function, which is used for outputting text and numbers to the screen of your computer. And the print function can receive a single argument, as in this case, where the program executes the print function after evaluating its parameter, which is this string here. It's a single string. Learning Python is interesting. And we specify the strings in between double quotes. Also, the print function can receive multiple arguments. The same function can have more than one argument, as in the second example. Learning Python is interesting is a single string, and there's a comma separating this second argument from the first one. So the second argument is right. You can also specify this as multiple arguments. Learning Python is interesting, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arguments. The print function has a special feature that it can add spaces by default in between its arguments. So it's going to output this string, learning Python is interesting, right, by adding extra spaces, single space in between each argument. So it would be similar to printing learning space Python space is space interesting up to here. We have also added the fifth one, so it's going to add space in between the first part and the last part. Similarly, it's going to add a space in between the argument 1 and the argument 2. So we call these text string literals. String literals are expressed in between a pair of single or double quotes, double quotation marks. You can have any symbols or any letters, numbers, exclamation marks, etc. in between a pair of quotation marks. There will be perceived as legitimate string values. There are some special symbols Python uses to differentiate operators from letters or symbols. If you need to add a special symbol, such as a quotation mark, as in this case, so Python will, I just scrolled down too much, sorry. Python will start a string by encountering a quotation mark. But if we want to add quotation marks to our original string, if we want to contain this quotation mark inside our string, we need to use the escape character, which is a backslash. Okay, the backslash character is going to tell Python that the symbol following this backslash is not the termination symbol of the string. The termination quotation mark is at the end of the string. But if we didn't use this escape symbol, it would terminate the string here. Okay, it would treat this as if this was the original string, this was the intended string, and the rest of the string was going to raise an error. Instead, we use the escape backslash, escape character, just before this double quotation mark, so that Python does not perceive that symbol as the terminal character in the string. So the output of this print function is this line contains a pair of quotation mark and quotation marks. So the actual string had quotation marks before and after the string, but that is just for the programming perspective of our source code. If we need to include these quotation marks inside, if we want them to be printed or be part of the string itself, we use the escape character. Similarly, we have this course name variable being assigned as string literal, which also contains the quotation mark before and after the some part of the string. You don't have to use double quotation marks inside your string. You might just omit the last one here. Okay, it's legitimate, but when you are defining a string, you have to start and end that string with a pair of quotation marks, either single or double quotation marks. They are valid. They are both valid in Python. So this is no different than this pair of escape character, the backslash, and the quotation mark is no different than another symbol such as an exclamation mark or a minus or a plus sign inside the string. If they are outside a string, they are special operators for adding, multiplying, or subtracting values, etc. But if you place a plus symbol inside a string, you don't have to escape that, because it doesn't violate, or it has no effect on the characteristics of that string. The string is started by a quotation mark and terminated by another quotation mark. In between those two marks, Python perceives that set of symbols and letters and numbers as part of the string. But when you want to add a quotation mark inside the string, you have to escape it. But if you add a plus sign inside the string itself, the plus has no effect when it is placed inside the string. It has no function or behavior such as adding two strings together. But if you add the plus sign after a string, that means that you want to concatenate some value to that string. So if the operator or a symbol has a special meaning that is evaluated inside the string, then you might want to escape it if you don't want that symbol or operator to perform anything, or just or simply just be printed on the output terminal. So we have further examples such as this print statement here. The code of the course is course code, which is a variable containing the value CMP150, and the name of the course is Introduction to Computing, including a pair of quotation marks. So when we print this, we're going to receive the full name of this course is with another space following the first one. So there is a space after this colon, and the print function is going to add a second an additional space and it is not because there is a space here. It's you could omit this space after the comma. It has no meaning. It's just for better readability. It's going to add that extra space after this first one. So is colon space another space, and the course code is CMP 150, and it's going to be followed by an additional space, and the course name is going to be printed, which is quotation marks introduction to blah 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 to computing, ending with a quotation mark, which is included here inside the course name variable. You can also want to include this backslash itself inside your string. As you know, backslash has the effect of displaying that special symbol inside your string, but if you want to display the backslash itself, you might simply escape it with another backslash. So when you type it in as double backslash, it's going to display only one backslash, as in this case. And we have this special new line symbol. You type in a single line of text, and within that text you might want to output your remaining part of the string on a new line, on the following line. You can have as many new lines as you like. It's going to simply put your cursor at the beginning of the next line on the terminal. It's equal to pressing your return key when you are typing in your word processor. Okay, and you can also use the tab symbol. Tab is equal to this symbol on your keyboard on the left third or fourth lobe, depending on your keyboard. It is used for indenting your code further to the left or right if you use it with shift. You achieve it inside your code, inside your string, by using this \t symbol. You can use as many of them as necessary if you need them to. It leaves something like 4 or 8 spaces depending on your operating system or on your computer. You can use it for formatting, aligning text in different lines, instead of leaving multiple spaces, you can use a single tab to have the same effect. But it has some drawbacks when you use a different word processor. If you're generating a text file using this using your code, the text editors which display that text file generated by your program might treat it differently, so they have different tab values, etc. So you need to be careful about who your audience is, who is going to use your output. If you're generating a, let's say, a bank account report that you want to send over to another bank or another institution, you need to make sure that your output is going to be processed correctly by their application. If you send a tab in your application, but if they at the same time expect a space instead of a tab, you might have difficulty in that interface. So it's important when you use the tab or space or other symbols, other separators in your text files. A text file is actually not only for reading some information, but it's also used for reporting or inter-process communication, in sending data, receiving data. So it's the simplest form of transaction. You might not always have web services or other kinds of protocols defined in between two applications. Text files are always a valid form of communication or interaction, either between human and computer or between computer and computer. So when defining such protocols, such communication protocols, you need to be careful about the organization of your output and the expectations from other people, other applications. So as we said, the print function might receive multiple arguments. You can also change the behavior of the print function, such as when it completes execution, it places the cursor to the beginning of the next line. You can simply change that by adding the AND operator to your code. At the end of the print function definition, we might, it's optional, add the AND operator specifying that this print is going to end the output by adding nothing. So this means nothing. It's an empty symbol. It means nothing. So if you want to add the end something else at the end of the string, when you output this instead of the new line, you might want to specify it to be and equals single quotation mark. There's no space in between these two and another quotation mark, and this means the printed output will leave the cursor at the end of that statement. You can also add other symbols followed by a new line. So if you want all your outputs to be terminated by some default set of characters, symbols, and after that, if you want to add another new line just to put the cursor to the next line, you might add something like this, and equals, let's say I want to add this set of values, and then I want to go to the next line. I might simply specify my AND operator to be this. So it's going to output this set of symbols at the end of the arguments it received. So the output of these two print statements is going to be displayed on the same line. This output does not have a new line at the end, so it's going to output until here. And we have a space at the beginning of the second print statement. It's going to be displayed here. And after that, so that the next call to the print can continue outputting on the same line. It's actually on the same line because of this word wrapping. Now you can see it on the same line. Okay. Although I issued two print statements, the first one just omitted the default new line and left the cursor at that line at the end of the first output. Clearing this once again. So the first one ends here, first print statement displays until there, and the second one starts after the end one. The cursor stays here. The next print function is going to continue from the same line because we have modified the default end character. Default end character is end equals \n. So if you don't state this operator, it's going to use this value at the end of the print function. If you change it once, it's not going to affect the remaining print function. So the second print function is going to use end equals new line. Although we modified this one as to be the null character or no character, it's going to affect only this print function. It's not going to change the default behavior for the rest of the print functions. They will use end equals new line by default. So this is a one-time operation and it affects only this print function. Let's make an assignment here. Let's say we want the default behavior to be generate the default end of string terminal string, let's say, to be generated by a function. For those of you who are curious about it, please find a way. So before printing each line, you should obtain some value from a function. Let's say def terminal string. Okay, you might receive some set of arguments, and just generate something here and return that value. Okay, so that you can call this function and check if you can call this function at the end of each print statement. There's also the separator character or separator operator, separation operator, that can be modified in the print function. So you know that by default it inserts a single space in between each argument. You can also modify that by specifying the sep operator, sep attribute, and you can set multiple symbols to be the separator. The output of this print function is going to be this, added by an underscore and asterisk, and another underscore, and the second argument is printed, and again the separator is similar. So if you specify a separator, all the arguments of the print function will be followed by this separator character, but the last one is not going to be displaying a separator after itself, but instead the separator is going to be used where the commas are placed. Okay, so you can also let's see how this behaves in our example code. You have all these examples placed inside a single source code. So 10 times 2 is, in this case, 10 times 2 is, it first evaluates the integer multiplication operation and then uses the result as an argument to the print function. So this is equal to typing 10 times 2 is 20 here. So you can specify strings and numbers as different arguments to the print function. But if you try to add an integer, a number to a string, you are going to receive an error. It's not this is not the same as typing 10 times 2 is plus. It's not going to allow this operation. So this is actually a let's say my string or my multiplication result string. Okay, I define a variable which is equal to 10 times 2 is plus 10 times 2 is plus the result of this operation. So if I try to do that, it's going to raise an error that you cannot add integers to strings. Okay, you can only concatenate string, not int, to string. So it's expecting the second argument of this addition or concatenation operator to be a string as well, but this generates a number. You can do it in Java, it allows that, but Python prohibits that. You have to be specific about specific about the concatenation operator. So you have to use a string with another string. We have the str function, which I think we are going to cover very soon. Str can be used to convert this integer value to a string. So it outputs something like this, and then you can use it simply by assuming that it has 20 placed inside a pair of quotation marks. A string can be quoted to string, but when you use them as arguments to the print function, not like this, but inside the print function, like this, okay, or you can do it like this as well. So place this part inside the variable and use that variable inside your print function. It's going to be performing that as well. So this variable contains a string. I use the variable and it's going to replace this variable with the string itself, and then it's going to add a space in between these two parameters, two arguments. The first one is 10 times 2 is this string, and the second one is the result of this multiplication operation, which is 20. So it's going to output the intended result as 10 times 2 is, followed by a space here, and it's followed by the 20, the numeric value of 20, converted to a string to be displayed on the screen. Okay. You can also have multiple variables displayed to be displayed in the print function. If you separate them by a comma, they're going to be treated as different arguments. These are different parameters to your print function, and it's going to insert spaces if you don't modify the separator operation. You can add something like this: separator equals to be 2 spaces, 3 spaces in between each argument, a space, a dot, and another space. So this is all valid. You can have multiple symbols, other strings, etc. You can also add the new line inside your separator. So you can insert a new line. It's going to display each argument on a separate line. Let's clear this up and get back to our mouse mode. Okay, now we want to receive some input from the user. We have so far output the results of our source code on the terminal, but we can also receive input from the user. For that purpose, we have a special function which is named the input function. Input function is where we can prompt some value. Please enter your name. The computer is simply going to output this text. Please enter your name, and then it's going to wait for some value to be typed in on the terminal, and whenever you hit enter, whenever you press the return key, the computer will receive that input and place it into the variable you specify here. So we specify the name variable to obtain the value from input. Whenever you hit the enter, you press the enter key or the return key, it's going to place the value typed in by the user inside this name value. You don't have to assign it to a variable all the time. You can simply use this part, input something. Just wait for user input. You might discard it if you don't use this assignment part. It's still going to expect you to press the return key at the end of your input. If you don't specify any input, it's also okay. Just step over that input statement by pressing the return key, and your computer is going to continue with the next line, which prints your name or which does other things depending on your implementation. You can also place this input inside the print itself. So what it does is it simply receives this input from the user, and as it obtains some value from user, it uses that value. It's a string literal. It uses that string as a parameter to the print function. So whenever you want to execute some function, you first have to obtain all its parameters. So this one is in our hands. We have welcome. We're going to use it, but not now. Before printing anything, we have to obtain this as well. Our program is going to wait here at this part of the statement for user to press the return key or the enter key, and then it's going to conclude that it has all the parameters it needed to call the print function. Now it's going to issue this print statement. So the first thing that's going to run in this application is the welcome part, but that's not a statement, it's just a string, so it doesn't execute anything. But the input itself is a function, so the program is going to first execute this function, obtain its result from the user, and then it's going to output welcome, please enter your name. So we have our example code here. Let's open that one and see the order of outputs that it displays. It first asks for the please enter your name part, which is the first statement. So I type my name, Murat, and it's still waiting if I'm going to enter anything else. Okay, I've accidentally pressed the return, so it displayed this print hi name. So it displayed hi followed by my name, which I typed in. I could have typed in something else. And at the second line, although it starts with welcome, it didn't display this one. It started displaying please enter your last name. So this is the first instruction it's going to execute in my print statement. My last name is Özgürt. It's still expecting me waiting for me to enter numbers. If I'm done with entering numbers, letters, etc., any characters, if I'm done with entering, I press the return key. Now it displays my full name, which I have accidentally provided as Murat space and 3 triple dots. Here we have welcome printed, name, which we have input earlier. This is my name, I think. And then it was asking for this instruction. It received the instruction, so it displayed this one. It obtained my last name, and it replaced this part with my last name. So it can now output welcome Murat and some spaces and my last name. So this is the order of execution in inline statements. Okay. When we want to do some calculations with user input, we can ask the user to input some values to our for our variables. So if I want to read x from the user, read the value of y, please enter a number, please. Enter a number, please. And then it's going to obtain a value, something like 12. Okay. And it's going to place this 12 into y. It's going to multiply 12 by 2. Okay, let's try it for 23. As you would guess, the result is not what we expect. Let me just copy this part to make it easier. Delete this part, paste it. So the first statement is expecting a number. Y is equal to input. This is a function. It starts with an opening parenthesis. Please don't forget this. It's one of the most common mistakes. Your friends expect this to read something just without typing the parentheses. It's not going to work. You have to provide an opening parenthesis, and if there is anything that you want to prompt to the user, you type it as a string in between quotation marks, and then it's going to receive this 23. Let me type 23, and it has output, instead of 46, it outputs 23 followed by a 23. This is because the input function returns a string, and if you multiply a string with a number, which is 2, it's going to replicate that string 2 times, 3 times the amount of number you entered. So instead of using it that way, you can simply solve the problem by adding an integer conversion or integer casting function, int, and as a parameter, let's say we receive this y as text. Okay, y as text. This is a variable that we received from the user, and now we can obtain our variable y, which we expect to be a number, simply by converting this y as text to integer using the int function. This is an int casting function, integer constructor, whichever you want to call it, but it's a function. It receives a string or a floating point number, whatever it receives. It receives this value and converts it to an integer value, a numeric value. Okay, 23 is not a numeric value like this. When you read it from the user, it's a string like this in between quotation marks. When you convert it to a number by int, it produces 23 as a numeric value. So these two are different. So if it can be converted to an integer, it will. If it cannot be converted, it's going to raise an error. So if you input something like 23 dot 23 dot, it's going to tell you that I cannot convert it to an integer because it contains some other symbols. You should be checking your input before attempting to use it as a number. This is where input validation comes in. So in the next slide, we see that we can use the integer typecasting or integer construction function. As you change that, so this is similar to the example we have done, y as text or the text variable. It can have the value 25 as a string again. Now you can obtain an integer from that string which contains a legitimate order of numbers that can represent a number. They don't represent a number, but they can be converted to a number in base 10. As you see here, the error was telling us that it's not a legitimate number in or invalid literal in base 10 format. So there might be other forms of obtaining integers in other bases. By default, it uses base 10. So this is not something that the interpreter can process. It cannot conclude that this is a number that can be converted to an integer. So if it didn't contain the dot at the end, it would simply treat this, okay, 2 is the first one, and it has another one following, so I should multiply 2 by 10 and then add the 3 to the result. So it has this internal implementation that it can conclude that this is 25 or 23 instead of simply by adding 2 and 3 together. Okay. So this solves our problem, and there's this example for you. You can use input inside the int itself. So if you go step by step, it's going to solve the problem inside out. So it's going to first evaluate this one. You can also place a function here that that generates the prompt. It's still valid, but we have it as a text. It's going to execute this inside part first, and then it's going to receive the value from the user. Expected value is a numeric form, and it's going to try to generate an integer value from the input function. And if it succeeds, it's going to use this integer value and place it inside the y variable. And then it's going to proceed with the regular multiplication because the value generated by the int function is a number. It's not going to replicate that number side by side. It's just going to multiply it with specified amount or use it in another mathematical calculation. Okay, you can read your age and see that it's this might not be your age, but it might be somebody else's age, 17. So the algorithm is similar. Typecasting is that you convert some values to another type value. You can convert integers to floating points, floats to integers, or convert all of them to strings. You can try to obtain numeric values from strings, but this doesn't mean that you're going to succeed. Only if it's a legitimate string of integers or floating point numbers. Floating point numbers are usually decimal numbers that you use. You can always convert an integer and float to a string, but the reverse is not true. Your program might fail to generate an integer, as in this case, or a floating point number from all strings. It doesn't mean that if your string contains some form of a number, it's going to extract that number and use it. No, you can have your own implementation for such cases. So you can check if 23 dot contains a legitimately ordered numbers. You can ignore the dot yourself, but by default, Python does not allow that. But it's a better practice to implement your code to understand, okay, there's a single number, so user might have entered some spaces before my input. So if user enters space 25 space or accidental comma when pressing the return, you might still implement some method that can intelligently identify the number, and okay, the user has entered a single number within this input, so it must have been 25. It depends on your implementation.